Sometimes, the smallest act of kindness becomes the greatest miracle of all. Emily Carter had worked at Maple Street Diner for almost 7 years. Every morning before sunrise, she tied her apron, poured fresh coffee, and greeted strangers with the same warm smile, even when life gave her very little to smile about. She never imagined that spending just $12 on a complete stranger would change her life forever. 10 years later, a sleek black luxury car stopped outside the same diner. A man stepped out, looked around quietly, smiled at the old building, and asked one question: "Does Emily still work here?" The cold wind swept through the empty streets of Cedar Falls, Ohio. It was one of those freezing January mornings when most people preferred staying under warm blankets instead of going outside. Emily unlocked the front door of Maple Street Diner at exactly 5:30 a.m. She switched on the lights, started the coffee machine, arranged fresh muffins inside the glass display, and took a deep breath. This little diner wasn't fancy. The chairs were old. The walls needed new paint. The coffee cups never matched. But to Emily, it felt like home. She had started working there when she was only 21 years old after her father passed away unexpectedly. College became impossible. Dreams had to wait. Bills came first. Now, at 31, she was still working 6 days a week. Every paycheck disappeared before the month even ended. Rent, electricity, medicine for her mother, groceries. There was never anything left. Yet no customer had ever seen Emily complain. Everyone knew her as the waitress who always remembered your favorite breakfast, who always smiled, who always said, "Good morning. I'm glad you're here today." Most customers thought she was the happiest person in town. They never knew she cried almost every night before going to sleep. That morning started like every other morning. Truck drivers filled the corner booths. Construction workers ordered eggs and bacon. An elderly couple shared pancakes every Friday. Around 8:15, the front door opened again. An old man slowly walked inside. His gray coat looked far too thin for the weather. His shoes were worn out. His hands trembled slightly from the cold. He quietly chose the smallest table near the window. Emily grabbed a menu and walked over with her usual smile. "Good morning, sir. Coffee?" The old man smiled gently. "Just water, please." Emily noticed something immediately. Most people who ordered only water weren't trying to stay healthy. They simply couldn't afford anything else. She didn't ask questions. A few minutes later, she returned with a glass of water. The old man thanked her softly. Then he reached into his pocket and slowly emptied a handful of coins onto the table. Pennies, nickels, dimes. He counted them once. Then again. His shoulders dropped. He quietly whispered to himself, "Not enough." Emily pretended not to notice, but her heart sank. She walked back toward the counter, opened her own wallet, and looked inside. $20. That was all she had until payday. She paused for a moment. Then she smiled to herself. She picked up the breakfast menu, walked into the kitchen, and quietly told the cook, "One full breakfast, please. Pancakes, eggs, bacon, and coffee." The cook looked confused. "Who ordered it?" Emily glanced toward the old man sitting alone by the window. "I did." Emily carried the breakfast plate herself. The aroma of fresh pancakes, crispy bacon, buttery toast, scrambled eggs, and hot coffee slowly filled the small corner of the diner. The elderly man looked up in surprise. I didn't order this." Emily smiled gently as she placed the plate on the table. "I know." He looked confused. "There must be a mistake." "There isn't." He stared at the breakfast for several seconds before looking back at Emily. "But I can't pay for it." She folded her hands in front of her apron and smiled. "You don't have to." His eyes immediately filled with tears. "No one has ever done something like this for me." Emily simply replied, "Everyone deserves a warm breakfast." For a long moment, the old man couldn't speak. He slowly removed his worn-out hat and held it against his chest. "Thank you." Those two words carried more emotion than Emily had heard in years. She quietly returned to serving the other customers. She didn't ask his name. She didn't expect anything in return. To her, it was just a small act of kindness. The old man ate every bite slowly, almost as if he wanted the moment to last forever. Before leaving, he walked back to the counter. "I wish I had something to give you." Emily shook her head. "You already gave me something." He looked puzzled. A smile. For the first time that morning, the old man laughed softly. Then he reached into his pocket and carefully removed a small silver coin. It looked old and worn from years of use. "I've carried this lucky coin since I was a young man," he said. "Please keep it." Emily gently pushed his hand back. "I can't take it. It's valuable to me." "So keep it," she answered. "Maybe one day it'll remind you that today wasn't your last bad day." The old man looked at her for several seconds. His eyes seemed to memorize her face. Then he nodded. "I'll never forget you." He quietly walked out into the cold winter morning. The little bell above the diner door rang once, and he was gone. Emily watched through the window until he disappeared around the corner. Then she returned to work. Life moved on. Days turned into weeks. Weeks became months. Nothing extraordinary happened. Emily continued working 6 days a week. She still smiled at every customer. She still helped people whenever she could. Sometimes she gave free coffee to lonely veterans. Sometimes she quietly paid for a child's lunch when a struggling parent came up short. No one knew. She never told anyone. Kindness wasn't something she wanted credit for. It was simply who she was. Years passed. The old diner changed very little. The paint faded even more. The coffee machine became older. Many regular customers moved away. Some passed away. New faces replaced old ones. Emily's hair became a little longer. A few silver strands appeared near her temples. Her mother eventually passed away after a long illness. The funeral expenses forced Emily to take on a second job during weekends. Life became even harder. There were nights when she sat alone in her small apartment wondering whether kindness really mattered. She had spent her whole life helping other people, yet her own life never seemed to get easier. One rainy evening, after finishing another exhausting shift, she opened an old kitchen drawer looking for batteries. Instead, she found a faded envelope. Inside were small thank you notes from customers she had served over the years. One simply read, "You smiled at me on the worst day of my life. Thank you." Another said, "You treated my father with dignity during his final visit here." Emily smiled through tears. Maybe kindness didn't always return as money. Maybe sometimes it returned as hope. She folded the letters carefully and placed them back inside the drawer. The next morning, she went back to work just as she always had, completely unaware that somewhere, hundreds of miles away, someone had spent the last 10 years searching for the waitress who had once bought breakfast for a stranger. Exactly 10 years later, on a bright autumn morning, Maple Street Diner looked much the same as it always had. The old sign outside had been repainted, a few tables had been replaced, and the coffee machine had finally been upgraded, but the heart of the place remained unchanged. Emily was now 41. She still wore the same warm smile. She still greeted every customer as though they were family. The younger waitresses often asked why she never seemed impatient, even during the busiest hours. Emily would simply smile and say, "Everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about." Just after 9 o'clock, the quiet rhythm of the diner suddenly changed. A sleek black luxury SUV slowly pulled into the parking lot. It looked completely out of place beside the small family diner. Several customers glanced through the windows. The driver stepped out first and respectfully opened the rear door. A tall man in a dark navy suit emerged. His hair was neatly combed. His shoes reflected the morning sunlight. Everything about him suggested success. Yet instead of walking confidently inside, he stood silently for a moment, staring at the diner with emotion in his eyes. It was as if he had waited years to return. He finally walked through the front door. The familiar bell above the entrance rang softly. Every conversation inside the diner seemed to pause for just a second. The man slowly looked around the room. His eyes moved from table to table. Then he quietly asked, "Does Emily Carter still work here?" One of the younger waitresses smiled. "She does." She pointed toward the counter. "There she is." Emily was pouring fresh coffee when she heard her name. She looked up. The man standing near the entrance smiled politely. "I'm sorry to bother you." Emily walked over. "Good morning. Have we met before?" The man smiled. "I don't think you'd recognize me." Emily studied his face carefully. There was something strangely familiar about his eyes, but she couldn't remember where she had seen him. The man reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. For a brief second, several customers thought he was reaching for his wallet. Instead, he carefully placed a small silver coin on the counter. Emily froze. She immediately recognized it. It was the same worn coin the elderly man had tried to give her 10 years earlier. She looked up in complete disbelief. "It can't be." The man smiled. "My grandfather carried this coin for over 50 years." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "The gentleman who came here." The man nodded. "Yes. He was my grandfather." Emily covered her mouth. "I've thought about him so many times. He thought about you every single day." Silence filled the diner. Even the customers nearby had stopped eating. The man continued. "When my grandfather came here 10 years ago, he had lost almost everything. He had no money, no family nearby, no hope. He told me he had reached a point where he believed the world had forgotten him." Emily listened quietly. Then he met a waitress who treated him with dignity instead of pity. The man's voice became emotional. He said that breakfast didn't just feed him. It reminded him that kindness still existed. Emily felt tears running down her cheeks. The man smiled gently. That single moment changed the way he saw life. He stopped feeling sorry for himself. He accepted help. He found work again. He slowly rebuilt his life. A few years later, he started a small woodworking business. It grew beyond anything he ever imagined. Emily could hardly believe what she was hearing. The man looked around the diner before speaking again. "My grandfather passed away 3 months ago." Emily lowered her eyes. "I'm so sorry. He left me something before he died." The man carefully removed a folded envelope from his jacket. "He made me promise that no matter how long it took, I would find the waitress who bought breakfast for a stranger." He gently placed the envelope into Emily's hands. "I've been searching for you for almost a year." Emily looked down at the envelope. Written across the front, in shaky handwriting, were just 6 simple words. "For the girl who gave me hope." Emily's hands trembled as she carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, folded several times, along with a small key and a faded photograph. The photograph showed the elderly man sitting inside Maple Street Diner 10 years earlier, smiling with a full breakfast in front of him. Someone had secretly taken the picture that morning. Emily gently touched the edge of the photograph. Tears blurred her vision. She unfolded the letter. The handwriting was shaky, but every word was clear. "Dear Emily, you probably don't remember me as well as I remember you. 10 years ago, I walked into your diner believing my life was over. I wasn't only hungry. I was completely broken. The breakfast you bought for me filled my stomach for a few hours. But the kindness you showed me gave me something far greater. It gave me a reason to believe tomorrow could be different. You looked at me with respect when I had forgotten how to respect myself. That day became the beginning of my new life. Every success I achieved afterwards started with your kindness. I wanted to thank you in person. Life didn't give me enough time. So I leave this responsibility to my grandson. Please never stop being the person you are. The world needs more people like you." With endless gratitude. Thomas Bennett. Emily couldn't hold back her tears any longer. The entire diner had fallen silent. Several customers quietly wiped their own eyes. The young man standing before her smiled through his emotions. "My grandfather read that letter almost every month. He kept telling our family, 'One day, someone should thank the woman who reminded me that good people still exist.'" Emily carefully folded the letter. "I never expected anything in return. I only bought him breakfast." The young man gently shook his head. "No, you gave him hope, and hope saved his life." He then pointed toward the small key inside the envelope. "My grandfather asked me to give you this." Emily looked confused. "What does it open?" The young man smiled. "It opens the front door of a little house just outside Cedar Falls." Emily stared at him in disbelief. "My grandfather bought it 5 years ago. He wanted it to belong to you." She looked completely speechless. I can't accept a house. You aren't accepting charity." He smiled warmly. "You're accepting someone's lifelong gratitude." Emily lowered her head, overwhelmed by emotion. The customers inside the diner quietly began clapping, not because someone had received a gift, but because they had just witnessed proof that kindness never truly disappears. It simply waits for the right moment to return. The owner of Maple Street Diner walked out from the kitchen. He had quietly watched everything. Without saying a word, he walked over to Emily. Then he smiled. "You've spent 20 years taking care of everyone else. I think it's finally time someone takes care of you." Emily couldn't stop crying. For the first time in years, they weren't tears of exhaustion. They were tears of gratitude. Outside the diner windows, the autumn leaves drifted gently through the air. Life looked exactly the same as it had the day Emily met Thomas. But everything had changed, because one simple breakfast had become the beginning of 2 completely different lives. Emily didn't resign from Maple Street Diner the next day. In fact, She continued working there for another 6 months. When people asked why she hadn't moved into the beautiful little house immediately, she always gave the same answer. This diner gave me a purpose long before life gave me a reward. She wanted to train the younger waitresses before leaving. She taught them something no restaurant manual could ever explain. Never judge a customer by their clothes. Some people carry invisible battles. Sometimes they don't need perfect service. They simply need someone to treat them like they matter. Those words slowly became part of the diner's culture. Every new employee heard the same lesson on their first day. Months later, Emily finally moved into the small white house Thomas had left for her. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't luxurious. But every morning, sunlight filled the kitchen windows, birds sang outside the porch, and for the first time in many years, Emily felt at home. She placed Thomas's handwritten letter inside a simple wooden frame and hung it above her fireplace. Whenever life became difficult, she would quietly read the final sentence again. Please never stop being the person you are. Those words became her daily reminder. A year later, Emily started something she called the breakfast promise. Every Saturday morning, anyone who couldn't afford a meal could eat for free. No questions, no paperwork, no embarrassment. If someone was hungry, they were welcome. At first, only 2 or 3 people came, then 10, then 20. Soon, local businesses began donating food. High school students volunteered on weekends. Retired chefs offered their time. The entire community slowly joined together. One small act of kindness had inspired hundreds more. News reporters eventually heard about the story. When they interviewed Emily, the reporter asked, "If you could go back 10 years, knowing everything that would happen, would you still spend your last $12 on that stranger?" Emily smiled without thinking. "I wouldn't hesitate for a single second." The reporter asked, "Why?" Emily looked toward the breakfast tables filled with families, volunteers, and people helping complete strangers. Then she answered softly, "Because kindness is never an expense. It's an investment. You may never know where it grows, but one day, it always finds its way back." The interview aired across the state. Thousands of people watched it. Many were inspired to begin their own acts of kindness. Some paid for a stranger's coffee. Some donated food. Some simply called a lonely family member they hadn't spoken to in years. The kindness continued spreading. One person, one family, one town at a time. Years later, a small wooden sign was placed inside Maple Street Diner. Every customer who walked through the door stopped to read it. It said, 10 years ago, a waitress bought breakfast for a stranger. She thought she was giving away $12. In reality, she started a lifetime of hope. And beneath those words, in smaller letters, was one final message. Never underestimate the power of one simple act of kindness.